What are the most evidentially supported near-death experiences and deathbed experiences? What do they tell us, if anything, about God and the afterlife? Our guest today, Dr. Steve Miller, is back by popular demand. He has been on my show at least half a dozen times, maybe more than anybody else now that I think about it. Steve, you and I have talked about hellish near-death experiences, whether or not near-death experiences support universalism, deathbed experiences. But recently I thought, you know what? If we were going to pull out these hundreds of cases and list the top best evidentially supported ones, like the top 5, given that you've researched this and written so many books on it, which 5 would you come up with? Now, I floated this idea to you. Tell me your initial thought when I framed it that way.
My initial thought was, I want to get people away from the individual experiences that they keep quoting over social media, and some of them they don't even know where the people came from. And let's stick with the evidence of the best studies by competent researchers, physicians who have studied near death experience. That's what I've done is said, what do the best researchers find? And so I was a little hesitant, and then I thought, well, no, actually, there is a tier one of research which says
Mm.
just start talking to people. What is the evidence? And even one case well supported can be evidence enough to turn somebody around to say, hey, there's something spiritual going on here. So after I got into it, I thought, yeah, this is good. This is good. So let's do this.
All right, I love it. Now, all these cases you have documented in your books. People can get them on Amazon, or you're willing to send them the PDFs for free, which I love. So you're not just making these up. These are not just from chat rooms. You have very carefully researched each one of these. So maybe tell us, how did you come up with these 5? Like, what was the criteria you used? And before we get into them, don't give us away which ones you're going to pick, but why kind of these 5? Why did they bubble to the surface?
Yeah, and some of it is a personal thing, but number
Mm.
one, I wanted to know, did this really happen? Is this coming from a source that I trust? Because often, even in people's books, they're quoting people that just uploaded something to a website or they heard it on social media, and then they start talking about what evidence this gives us. So we don't even know if this happened. This person may have mental issues. Who knows what's going on? So my criteria were basically, I want to know, is there evidence that this really happened? Do we have a good source or these good witnesses of it? And then number 2, in what way does this point to the afterlife? Is this just a God of the gaps
Hmm.
thing where we're saying, oh, we can't understand it, therefore it must be God? Or does something about the experience after actually support the idea of the afterlife or something spiritual going on rather than a naturalistic process?
Okay, that's really helpful. So there might be some strongly supported cases where we trust the witness. They report things that seem to be true, but they're not as significant about the afterlife, about maybe the character of God, as some of these may be. So we're leaning into those that not only are evidentially supported, but are informative about truth and the kind of universe that we live in. That's really interesting criteria. Now, last question. I know people are eager to hear, and I'm eager to hear you lay out your case for these. Remind us just again, what is a near-death experience, and how is it similar and or different from a deathbed experience?
Well, in brief, a near death experience, for example, someone will experience cardiac arrest, clinical death, where the cessation of heartbeat and breathing. They shouldn't be experiencing anything during this time consciously, but then they are revived and they come back with a story to tell about a super vivid experience they had during this time. That's a near death experience. They almost had a final death, but they were brought back. In a deathbed experience, there are actually a series of different types of experiences people have surrounding their final death. So, for example, in a deathbed vision, they might see things on the other side right before they die, like angels coming to welcome them or deceased relatives. That would be a deathbed experience. And I should add, too, that these are 5. This is not hard to come. The hard thing is to narrow down which 5 I'm going to have. Gary Habermas has 2 very good articles, one in Blackwell Companion of Substance Dualism, very academic source, also in the first appendix of his first book on the resurrection that he published recently, and he documents over 300 near-death experiences that he think have strong evidence that they're more than something physical. So I'm just pulling five of them that have impact on me, and they're also kind of a variety of pack which have evidence going different directions as far as why I think they're evidential for spiritual realities.
So the challenge was not how do I find five? The challenge was how do I narrow down because there's a plethora of so many are out there. And again, I just want to highlight, and by saying this, I'm not saying this means it's necessarily true, but there are neurosurgeons, there are doctors, there's philosophers, very careful thinkers assessing these from a range of worldviews in peer reviewed journals. And I think of that 2017 or 2018 academic peer-reviewed book by I think it was University of Missouri State,
Yes.
laying some of these cases out. This is not astrology we're talking about here or just dream assessment in some Freudian sense. These are very carefully assessed. Now, with that said, people can make up their own minds. They can look these up. You will send them your book where you document these for free, which I think is remarkable. But with that said, let's jump in. Why don't we start with number 5 and then go to number 1? Now, as we're going down, is this your order? Like they are better assessed, like number 1 when we get there, you think this is the top one, or not necessarily so?
For me, they're getting a little more evidential, or I like something about the evidence. So
Okay,
further as we go along. So
fair enough,
let's
but they're all
start.
well supported. Okay, so this first one that you told me you want to discuss, I was familiar with it. I think it's interesting. I was surprised you picked it. It's Mark Twain's evidential deathbed experience. What on earth happened, and why did you pick that one?
Well, I thought it was interesting because a lot of atheists and secularists pick Mark Twain as kind of one of their own because he was typically um, very skeptical of religion.
Mm,
He was kind of down on organized religion, and so they would think of him as a very secular guy. But here he is talking about some experience that can't be explained well with naturalism. So I thought it was good as an example of one that's coming not from a spiritual person, but somebody who's just telling it because it's one of the most remarkable things that happened in his life.
mm. I love that. All right, so tell us what happened with it. Tell us kind of the story of what he reported, how it affected him, how we know it's evidenced.
To keep it quick and to actually make sure I get details right, some of this I will read, some of it I will just
That's
say
great.
personally. But uh, Mark Twain, pen name for Samuel Clemens, wrote some of the best books of history that we all love and enjoy. Very famous during his time. But during his riverboat days, when he helped on riverboats, his brother Henry was also working on a riverboat. They both went to go on a riverboat to New Orleans on the Pennsylvania was the name of it. And Mark Twain got into some kind of a scuffle with somebody and got thrown off the ship, and he couldn't go. So just his brother went. Well, that night, 11 o'clock in the evening, um, Henry left for the riverboat. That night, Mark Twain had an extraordinary dream. Now, somebody online says, "Oh, I don't think this really happened. I can't find it anywhere from Mark Twain." But I went to his autobiography. There it was. He dedicated a whole section to this. The
Interesting.
Probably one of the top biographies of Mark Twain mentions it as well. So very well documented. So let's just allow him. These are his words.
Okay.
He from his autobiography. He says, "In the morning I woke." So this was the night after his brother left. Okay, and his brother was like 20 years old. You're not expecting him to die, right? So in the morning I woke and I had been dreaming. The dream was so vivid, so like reality that it deceived me, and I thought it was real. In the dream, I had seen Henry a corpse. He lay in a metallic burial case. He was dressed in a suit of my clothing, and on his breast lay a great bouquet of flowers, mainly white roses, with a red rose in the center. The casket stood upon a couple of chairs. I dressed, moved toward the door, thinking I would go in there and look at it, but I changed my mind. So he went out. He got up. Mark Twain starts going, expecting that this is real. He thought it was something that really happened. He went into the room and saw there was no casket there and said, "Oh, good. It was just a dream," but it was so vivid and so specific. Well, the next day, or a few days later, just below Memphis, Tennessee, the boat's boiler exploded. Henry was burned and bruised, and within a week, he died. This is what happened. Again, Mark Twain's words. He was carried to the deathbed, and I went away for a while to a citizen's house, slept off some of my fatigue. And meantime, something was happening. The coffins provided for the dead were of unpainted white pine, but in this instance, some of the ladies in Memphis made up a fund of about $60, and which was a lot at that time, and bought a metallic case. When I re-entered the dead room, Henry lay in that open case, and he was dressed in a suit of my clothing. So this is reality. His brothers died. Now he comes into this situation that's identical to his dream, dressed in a suit of my clothing. He had borrowed it without my knowledge during our last sojourn in St. Louis, and I recognized instantly that my dream of several weeks before was here exactly reproduced, except for one piece, which was immediately supplied, for just then an elderly lady entered the place with a large bouquet consisting mainly of white roses. In the center of it was a red rose that she laid on his breast. Now, in his autobiography, he says that he was telling some gentlemen about this later in life, and one said, "Well, your memories shift during life. It's been a while since that happened." He said, "No, no, no. This is one of these things that's just like a picture in my mind. I can come up and I can see it." In other words, it was no ordinary dream from the beginning. This was something special that he couldn't forget, much like people's near death experiences. They'll say years later, people who study them will re interview the people and they'll tell exactly the same story because it's like a video they can rerun in their minds. So here's a person who's not excited about giving any kind of evidence for spiritual things, and yet this was a very important thing that happened in his life. And I mean, how does it approach you? It doesn't really talk about God in heaven in a sense, but there's something that seems to not be consistent with naturalism here.
I it's bizarre on so many levels. I was trying to think of how naturalistically would I explain this away. Number one, maybe he misremembers. You dealt with that. Maybe he's lying. Maybe he has some reason to tell it to sell books. Like you have to come up with some story, but why not accept the account that he gives, especially given the worldview behind it? Now, the next question you and I have is, okay, if Mark Twain reports this, what does it mean? Now we're moving from fact to interpretation. And
Hmm.
sometimes in near-death experiences, we will interpret them based on our worldview. So even A.J. Ayer, I was curious if you're going to pick this one, or A.J. Ayer, you might say it, an atheist,
Hmm.
has a near-death experience. It was
Yes.
vivid, it was life-changing, but didn't shift his worldview. That seems to be the case with Mark Twain. So I think it's well evidenced. I think it indicates like there's no way he could know this ahead of time naturalistically. Something supernatural was going on. I've heard you frame it this way, Steve, that these are like suggestions that there's more to reality than matter, that there's something or someone who knows the future and the past, that maybe life continues beyond the grave. I don't know that we can read more into it from this, but I think it's a fascinating case. Now, you sent me a little about this, which I thought was interesting. There was another evidentially near death experience case, and this is before we get to number 4, that came from atheist skeptic Michael Shermer. Now, Michael Shermer, I had him on this show about 2 months ago. We debated 2 hours, God, morality, and the soul. And I've thought about having him back on to debate near-death experiences. So if you're watching this and you want that show, comment below. Maybe we would do that. He's probably open to it. I like him a lot. But he had an article in Scientific American titled Infrequencies, where he admitted to an experience that he would have dismissed or disbelieved had it been reported to someone else. After his wedding, his wife was sad, regretting that her deceased grandfather was not able to share in their wedding. When his old broken radio, which they had never been able to repair, started playing love songs. The odds of the old radio from Germany suddenly reviving at precisely the moment she needed it, being set precisely to a station playing love songs, is quite extraordinary, Shermer concedes. You'd figure the odds to be something close to 1 in a million, or whatever the odds are. I don't know how you tabulate that. There's these type of experiences that are common, that don't prove God, but can't be explained as coincidence or lying, especially when it comes from Mark Twain, A.J. Ayer, or Michael Shermer. Your thoughts on that one? Anything else on the Mark Twain one before we move to number 4?
Yes, I think Shermer's wife said it well, right? When that happened, she said, "It's my grandfather."
Oh,
There's my grandfather, because was regretting that her grandfather was not able to be there at their wedding. And boom, what are the odds that it would happen right at that moment when she's having that regret? And yet he had no explanation for it. Now, his explanation basically is, when he gets to read that book in Frequencies, if you're out there, I mean, read the article. It was in Scientific American. It's available online. And basically, he says, "Well, this shook me to the core
mm,
originally." Now, later he says, "Well, there are billions of people in the world. Weird things happen. It could just be one out of those billion things." And that's what he does basically with with this experience that we just talked about with Mark Twain. He says, "Okay, well, yeah, he accepts that it happened." Worley, another atheist, accepts that this happened to Mark Twain, but they just say, "Oh, well, it's 1 in a billion, of things, and weird things happen." But that argument falls apart when you start saying, "Now, wait a minute, this isn't the only one that happened."
there we
It's
go.
not just that this happened to you. In fact, my wife, after I began studying these things, she said, "Did I ever tell you about when I had a vivid dream about my grandmother dying when she wasn't even ill? And then a few months later, she sure enough died. The next month, she was diagnosed with an incurable breast cancer. Then she died, and she said, when I walked into that funeral, it was just like I'd foreseen." And I thought, this is my wife. You know, I trust her. And then, so these experiences are actually quite common. And of course, the British survey that Dr. Sidgwick and others did from Cambridge University, they actually studied 17,000 people, interviewed them, and found that 10%, oh, maybe 4 to 5% of them had had experiences of crisis apparitions, where they saw someone who had died that they had no idea had died. And that would reinforce that this is not just kind of one out of a billion thing, but it's happening normally to people all the time.
Hmm. You ready for number 4?
Now let's do it.
This one
So
is
no,
interesting. We're shifting from kind of a skeptic to an evidentially supported near death experience now, not a deathbed experience of a child, but it's reported by her physician. Tell us what happened.
yeah. So this is Melvin Morse, is a pediatric, academically oriented pediatrician who worked in emergency rooms. And so he was kind of agnostic at the time. So again, you've
Hmm.
got a person who's not, these are not evangelicals trying to support their faith, sort of agnostic researcher guy. And somebody was brought into the hospital room, into the emergency room. And he said, as I stood over Katie's lifeless body in the intensive care unit, I wondered if she could be saved. And basically, she had been found face down in a YMCA swimming pool. Nobody knew what had happened. But when she came in, she was out of it. I mean, they did get her heartbeat started, but she was just totally unconscious, no gag reflex. Artificial lung machine was breathing for her. She was, in the words of the other physicians there, she was just a train wreck. 10% chance maybe of surviving.
Oh.
But then suddenly she recovered. And within a few
Hmm.
days, he was able to actually go back and talk to her. So, one of the things he wanted to know, and again, this is a good academic. This is a person who I've read at least one of his peer reviewed articles, and he's the kind that documents things meticulously.
Hmm.
So he's talking to her, and he wants to know what happened. It's important for a physician to know, did she hit her head on the bottom, by diving, or did somebody keep her under, or what happened? And so he asked her, he said, what happened? And she said, oh, do you mean when I saw my heavenly father? And he said, well, that's a good place to start. Why don't you tell me about that? And he says, she said, I met Jesus. This is a little child. I met Jesus and the Heavenly Father. And he said, maybe it was the shocked look on my face or her shyness, but that's kind of all she would talk about that day. So he came back a couple of days later and said, well, let's talk about this some more about what happened. She remembered nothing about the drowning itself. Her first memory was of darkness and feeling that she was so heavy she couldn't move. Then a tunnel opened, and through that tunnel came Elizabeth. Elizabeth was
Mm.
tall and nice, bright golden hair. She accompanied Katie up to the tunnel where she saw her late grandfather and met several other people. Among her friends were two boys named Andy and Mark, who played with her and introduced her to many people. At one point, she was given a glimpse of her home. One of her brothers was playing with a G.I. Joe, pushing him around. Think of how specific this is,
It's
much like the
detailed.
Mark Twain. This is detail. Okay, he wasn't playing with something else, cars or Matchbox cars or whatever. It's G.I. Joe pushing him around the room in a Jeep. One of his sisters was combing the hair of a Barbie doll, singing a popular rock song. She drifted into the kitchen and saw her mother preparing a meal of roast chicken and rice. Then she looked into the living room and saw her father sitting on the couch staring quietly ahead. Later, when Katie mentioned this to her parents, she shocked them with her vivid details, and they confirmed that that's what was cooking. That's what everybody was doing in the house. Yet this was far away. Katie was in the hospital lying there, right? Finally, Elizabeth, who seemed to be a guardian angel to Katie, took her to meet the Heavenly Father and Jesus. The Heavenly Father asked if she wanted to go home. She cried. She said she wanted to stay with him. Now, this is counterintuitive. You know, you've got a child who wants to be with their
Mm.
toys, with their dolls, with their parents. She is so comfortable in this heavenly home that she wants to stay. Then Jesus said, well, don't you want to see your mother again? And she said, yes. And at that point, she awoke. So Morse, like a good researcher, he interviews the parents. He interviewed other nurses. The nurses confirmed the first thing she said when she woke up were, where's the two boys that she had met on the other side, and called them by name, and confirmed it with others. And there you have it. It took him from being an agnostic to believing there must be something on the other side. Now, let me mention this. Let me go back
Okay.
to how this may be evidential. But the great atheist Bertrand Russell was asked one
Mm.
time in an article, uh, what kind of evidence would convince you that God exists? He
Mm.
said this: I think that if I heard a voice from the sky predicting all that was going to happen to me during the next 24 hours, including events that would seem highly improbable, and if all these events then proceeded to happen, then I might be convinced at least, uh, I would perhaps be convinced at least of the existence of some superhuman intelligence.
Mm.
So what are we seeing? Both from Mark Twain. Mark Twain saw things in the future that he couldn't have known before. To me, this fits the bill for the type of evidence that Bertrand Russell, who is really a great philosopher and has thought these things through, would take as evidence. And then we see a little girl knowing things that are happening outside of her room in her home. She actually described the doctors who first came in, and more so, this was incredible. She described the first doctor that came in. She described me to a T. Uh, how could this have happened? And so I think this is a good way of approaching evidence to say, according to naturalism, I don't know what's going to happen 2 days from now that are out of the normal, that are very
Mm.
specific. Via naturalism, I don't know what's going on at the house next door. They're purely guesses. We have much evidence of this, that we don't know these things. So when people do know these things, I'm thinking this points to the supernatural, kind of like signs and wonders. It's a wonder in the sense that it goes against the natural order. It's a sign in that it points to something, and in her case, to a heavenly Father and to Jesus and to uh, an angel who might be a guardian angel, I think it points to the other side. Do you have any thoughts on this one?
I love that you picked this case. It's one I was familiar with before for a few reasons. Number one, it's a physician who was agnostic. And on my channel, I've interviewed Jeffrey Long, Michael Sabom, and doctors are the best at analyzing this stuff because they're critical and they're skeptical and they're systematic in their thinking. I've got Eben Alexander coming on soon. His book, Proof of Heaven, a
Mhm.
neurosurgeon. You suggested I interact with him. Like, these are very careful, formally critical physicians, not looking to prove some thesis, but having their thesis shifted by these kinds of
Mhm.
experiences. Now, you hit on it. There's a lot of accounts of near death experience. I've told stories here. I've shared some with you of friends of mine, students of mine in our apologetics program at Biola that I believe, but they don't have the kind of evidential support that this case does, where she says, oh, here's specific details taking place in a different locale that you couldn't know if there wasn't either somebody giving you that information or a soul that can be separated from the body to see this. And I started to think, well, my kids, they could guess we're sitting at a dinner table and maybe we're talking about a superhero movie. Maybe dad's talking about what's going on in Bible or culture. Maybe they have this for dinner. But I started to think, well, there's different places we sit. There's different conversations we have. There's different toys. To get all those details right is where it becomes mathematically virtually impossible. Not to mention, why would a kid make this up? Now, there are
Mhm.
cases of books that have been pulled back, stories about kids' experience, and it seems it's the adults who are maybe using them to manipulate and tell a story. That's not the case here. So I'm with you. I think this one is perplexing. If I were a naturalist, I would seriously take the time to read this story, give pause, think about it, and just simply ask, what's the best explanation? That
Now,
matter is all that there is? Or is there maybe a God? Is there life after death? Is there a soul? And this is one strong pointer that there is. Anything else in this case before we go to number
well,
three?
some naturalists would say, well, maybe she was primed for a belief like this, and she was just living out her expectation of what would happen at death. Well, number one, when you're drowning, I'm not
Hmm.
sitting around thinking of my worldview. I'm thinking of how to get to the top of the water. I kind of doubt that she was even thinking about that at this time. But Morse did interview the mother and say, "Tell me about y'all's background. Is this what y'all as a family
Hmm.
thought would happen at death?" And she said, "No." Said, "We really didn't talk about things like this." We said one time she had a relative who died, and I said, "Well, it's like you're passing over a river," which was nothing like what happened in her experience. So this is something that came totally unexpected to the family. And children generally don't have that well developed a worldview. And so they just kind of tell things like it is without trying to feed it into a worldview. So to me, and if you go past this, there are people, Angela Ethier has done a PhD dissertation in nursing where she talked to parents about their children's deaths. And I should mention also, so this is not just, again, just a one off, one out of a billion thing. We've got research of many cases. I like this little book, A Window to Heaven by Diane Comp. She was an academic pediatrician, pediatric oncologist who taught at Yale. And she was an agnostic or atheist, more atheist existentialist is the way she would describe herself, until she started working with children and seeing things that happen to them
Hmm.
spiritually like this at death. Little book. If you're not interested in reading a lot, it's very well written and you can get it for probably 99 cents on Amazon.
So, your point I want to emphasize before we move on about staying calm amidst something like drowning is really intriguing to me because these near death experiences sometimes are planes that are crashing, somebody is drowning, struggling for life, somebody's having a heart attack. I mean, unless you are trained in the most elite special forces like the Navy SEALs or something, where you stay calm under pressure, it's the opposite of human nature to have clarity of thought, calmness of reasoning. It just defies everything we know about human nature. And to me, is just one other hint that suggests something else may be going on here. This is not just a dream that somebody had for other reasons we could get into. All right, so we started with kind of a skeptic, Mark Twain, or so to speak, maybe an agnostic. I don't know exactly his worldview, but certainly not a Christian. We moved to a child reported by a physician and her mother. The third one that you said is a respected physician encounters his first near death experience. Now, when you mentioned that, there's a whole lot of physicians who I was curious who you would be pointing towards. So tell us which physician you picked and why.
Right. I mean, you could have gotten Dr. Bruce Grayson on this with his first
Mm,
experience, which shattered his worldview. You could look at Pim van Lommel, who did a great study in the Netherlands on this, his first experience. This one was interesting to me because number one, it's recent. Number two, it came in the context of uh, a New York Academy of Sciences event. This is not where you expect to hear stories like this, and where a lot of physicians would hesitate to even talk about experiences like this because they're afraid of ruining their reputation. But this was, you can look it up. I don't think you can find it searching as much on YouTube as you would just Google because it's a video that's on their website. I believe
mm,
it's on the New York Academy of Sciences website. It was 2019. Moderated, this was a panel moderated by Sam Parnia, who has an MD and PhD degree, associate professor of Department of Medicine, New York University. He's all into critical care, and he's interviewing a panel of people. Within that panel is Dr. Tom Ofterhide, who's a professor of emergency medicine and director of the Resuscitation Research Center of the Medical College of Wisconsin. Now, they're dealing with multiple issues of how do you tell when somebody's really dead and they're past being able to be resuscitated? What's the latest technology we have to resuscitate people? They're dealing with all these issues. And then, uh, and then all of a sudden, Sam Parnia says, well, tell me about these weird experiences that happen around death. And Dr. Ofterhide says, let me tell you about one happened right at the beginning of my career. He was like an intern. He was in a hospital. The head physician had said, I'll be with you. I've got your back if anything really weird happens. But hey, I'm going to bed down here and you do your rounds. Well, he was a little disappointed that the guy wasn't with him, but surely nothing special would happen. Well, sure enough, the worst happened. All the alarms go off. Someone's heart is stopped. They're all called in to resuscitate. The nurses rush down. He rushes in, and they get the man resuscitated. But after they get him resuscitated, his heart stops again, and they have to re-resuscitate him. And then his heart stops again. He's not becoming fully conscious. They're just getting his heart stopped. Well, eventually, all the others left
mm,
Dr. Ofterhide in the room, and so will you just keep resuscitating him? I mean, this guy's not going to make it, obviously, but he did make it. So Dr.
mm,
Ofterhide comes by the guy's room to see him, and finally, and becomes kind of his physician. Well, before the guy's dismissed, he said, Dr. Ofterhide, I want to talk to you a minute about what happened that night.
mm.
He said, here are the things I remember. Number one, I remember you going out into the hallway. This is the night when he's unconscious, right? His eyes are not open. And he says, Dr. Offer, you went out and talked to my family in another room. And to be honest, you were not very positive about me. Number two, in the middle of the night, you ate my lunch. And Ofterhide said, well, I mean, this guy wasn't going to eat it. There was this lunch sitting there. And he said, you
Okay.
ate my lunch. But he said, thirdly, and he said, you, and there you were feeling sorry for yourself because the main physician had not accompanied you on your rounds that night. Now, Dr. Ofterhide said, I started thinking about that. Now, I could think of, okay, maybe somebody told him at some point what was being talked about in another room. Maybe he came just a little bit conscious and actually saw me eating his food. I mean, these are kind of way out.
Yeah.
Maybe it could happen. But how did he know my thoughts? thoughts. I never said those out loud.
Hmm.
He said, that's what made me realize there was something special about this. Now, to me, when you hear a guy who is who's a research physician who's got no reason to be up there lying. I've never seen any book by him on this or trying to get you know, get on YouTube and get hits from people, people coming in and subscribe to his channel. He's just telling something that happened as an example of a lot of near death experiences and something that happens pretty commonly where Dr. Sabom and others found that people could actually describe things that were going on when they were experiencing clinical death. He shares this, and I think that's pretty powerful coming from
Hmm.
a respected physician at a secular scientific conference, and he gives me some things that have happened that he says, I just can't imagine how this could have happened naturalistically. It seems to point to something on the other side. What do you think of that?
So a couple things come to mind. Number one, you said he has no known reason to lie. I think he has good reason to not share this story. I mean, I
Yes.
think Sabom and Long and others, if I remember correctly, have said they've taken some criticism, taken some heat. Some people think they're crazy in academic circles for sharing this. So, one reason why I tend to give credibility to these kind of testimonies, including what you said, not selling a book, not building a channel. And by the way, hopefully people know that I have no problem building the channel. I believe in what I do, but it's not like he's trying to get something personal out of it or has just some agenda behind it. It would be easiest for him to just say nothing. So
Yes.
that gives more
That's the
credibility
safest
to
thing to
me.
do in his position.
And it makes me wonder how many other physicians and other people don't share these things because they don't want to be called out professionally. They don't want their aunts and uncle and friend to think they're crazy. They don't want social media to cancel them. I suspect there's a lot more of these than people even share. And so when you
And
shared the story, you said that I think the doctor said to the fellow these words. He said, just simply, tell me more. Those words, when I first read your book, it's probably, I don't know, 6, 8 years ago or so, I really thought near death experiences, I just thought, I don't buy it. I'm an apologist, but I'm not convinced. I was really surprised by the evidence. And so
me too. Me too. Very surprised.
just last week, someone mentioned a deathbed experience kind of thing. And I said, tell me more about that. And if you're listening for it, there's people all over the place. So even if somebody said these are all false, it is a common belief and experience that humans think they are having today. And we should minimally be talking about it, hearing people out. But this case you gave is well evidenced, shifts the worldview of a physician. Pretty powerful stuff. Anything else on this one?
Yeah, I just say somebody else's top most convincing near death or deathbed experience is going to be somebody that comes from your circles of trust, like your family.
Hmm.
Because I was just shocked, as you were, that when I started telling people this is what I'm studying, that I start getting these stories from people I trust, like my wife, like others around me that I had no idea had these, and they're evidential as well. In fact, I heard Gary Habermas speak on the resurrection, a C.S. Lewis event in the Atlanta area, and I just was saying hi to people, and somebody said, "Oh, this guy just read your book and is real interested in near-death experiences. Let you talk to him." It turns out this guy was a top research scientist for all his life, now retired. He shared with me a near-death experience of his atheist dad,
Mm.
who was no longer an atheist after he had his experience. But he said he just kind of dismissed it as a child when he heard it as, oh, he had a hallucination. But then when he saw one in his own practice, and it was exactly the same
Mm.
experience going to the other side. But you know what? He never told anybody. He didn't tell his, I think he said, and he's retired now. This happened way earlier, like in the 1970s when he saw his last near death experience. He said, I never told anybody because I was afraid in my profession, being a research scientist, that people would label me as a crazy. So there's no reason for him to be telling me this story. And then I was out in Houston at the top probably cancer center in the world. I was there 2 weeks ago. So my brother's recovering from a bone marrow transplant, having a lot of side
Mm.
effects. Please pray if you're in the listening audience for my brother Richard. But we talked to a nurse who was working with him, and Richard said, "Oh, let me tell you what my brother's studying because you said you used to be a an emergency nurse, and do you have any experiences like that?" She said, "Yes, there was a child who was severely burned. Her heart had stopped. We were starting the resuscitation, and then I saw her spirit come out of her body." And she said it was not a charged spirit; it was a perfect spirit lifting up, and she saw a bright, like heavenly light. And she said it just gives me chills down my spine, to think about it. And and the other person I talked to, the research physician, said it caused the hair to stand up on his arms. Now, these are researchers, these are people like in the top cancer institute in the world, and they're talking about the hair raising up on their arms and a chill running down their back because it's not something you expected from the naturalistic course of things and pointed to something else like the
Mm.
afterlife. But go ahead. Let's move through if we can. This is
Yeah,
interesting stuff, though.
thanks for sharing that personally about your brother. This is not just academic; it's personal for
It
all
is
of
not.
us
It is
in
not.
different ways. And my co-host of a separate podcast that I do, Scott Ray, when we were talking about this, he is one of the leading Christian ethicists in the world and deals with a lot of issues of death and dying. And as we talked about this, he's like, I need to really rethink how I minister to people who are dying because of the reality of this. Now, we don't need to go into that right now. You and I did a full episode talking about that.
Yes.
So people can go walk through, and it's just so game changing. But so far, we've talked about a deathbed experience from Mark Twain, a near death experience from a child, a respected physician encounters his first near death experience. What about a respected physicist's report of a deathbed vision? Tell us about that one.
This is from Sir William Barrett, if you want to get the book and the original source. He was a very famous person in his time who I mean, Sir William Barrett, he was knighted because of his scientific accomplishments, taught at a very well respected school. His wife was a physician, and his wife came home one day and said, "You've got to hear about this patient I had. She was dying in childbirth, and the most remarkable thing happened." Um, let's see, let me just start here. Suddenly, this is talking about the patient who's dying. Suddenly, she looked eagerly towards one part of the room, radiant smile illuminating her whole countenance. She's dying. Okay.
Mm.
She's dying. She's about to lose her husband, her child that's just born, all these things. But she's radiant. And oh, lovely, lovely, she said. I asked, "What is lovely?" "What I see," she replied in low, intense tones. "What do you see?" "Lovely brightness, wonderful beings." It's difficult to describe the sense of reality conveyed by her intense absorption in the vision. Then it went to another place. "Oh, it's my father. I'm so glad to see he's coming. He is so glad to see me. It would be perfect only if my husband could be here as well." She goes on about the vision. I know we're running out of time, but then there was another part of it that made it especially evidential that something was going on. Dr. Phillips, and by the way, Sir William Barrett, he's a scientist. He goes and interviews not just his wife, but the attending physician and a family member that was there. And they said that the most important evidence she gave was the following account. Her husband was leaning over her, speaking to her. When pushing him aside, she said, "It's so beautiful." And then she said, "Oh, and there's
Mm.
Vida," referring to her sister, of whose death 3 weeks previously she had not been told.
Wow.
And she said, "Oh, Vida is there." And so this is a special type of experience that's been studied where someone that they see on the other side, they were never told of yet. And so Dr. Barrett interviews the mother and said, "Tell me about this." And they said, "Oh, yeah, nobody was going to tell her about the death of her sister because they were afraid in her state this might put her in a depressed state." And so, what
Mm.
evidence? This influenced Sir William Barrett so much that he wrote not only this book, but two other books about deathbed type experiences. His whole life, he would gather these stories, look for the evidence, and write about them because he felt like it was so impactful on evidence for the afterlife.
What's fascinating about that is that it's not just the only case. Again, if there were one, I'd be like, maybe somebody told her that we didn't know. Like maybe, there's ways you could counter that. But you've documented cases of people, near death experiences, not so much deathbed experiences, although maybe some of both. People had an experience coming back and saying, I saw my twin, and the parents never told them that in childbirth or delivery, their twin had passed away. Or I saw my biological father. They were never, or my biological mother, never told that they were adopted. Multiple counts. I saw this person, and especially before technology, words sometimes took longer to reach people. I saw him in the afterlife, and that person had been dead. Multiple cases like this, which to me are just compelling. And you've got to struggle for a naturalistic account for this one. So, this is another one that just gives me goosebumps, especially in that most vulnerable state of your life and you're dying. Why are you making up stories? Like you're just, it's not plausible to me that that would be the best explanation. Well, we've got one more, but any last thoughts on that story?
Let's just move ahead and get one more under our belt, and then we can see if there are any naturalistic accounts. I should mention that typically when people give naturalistic explanations for near death and deathbed experiences, they'll talk about, oh, well, it's some characteristic of the dying brain, like lack of oxygen or some DMT type substance that might be released in the brain but some of these are not some of these, like Mark Twain, he was not dying, right? The shared death experiences are by other people who are doing fine, but they share in some way the experience with others. So when you look at all the naturalistic answers, if you do your research, you'll find that they're just not consistent with the data that we have so far from good researchers.
Mm,
Now, the Pam Reynolds case, let's just go straight into it. She was a
let's do it.
35-year-old mother who underwent a complex surgery to repair a giant aneurysm in her cerebral artery. This was reported by Michael Sabom, who is a cardiologist, one that I
Yep,
know
I've
personally.
interviewed him.
He's
Yep,
really he's a no nonsense type. Let's just stay with the facts guy,
I
and he'll
agree.
just go relentlessly after the facts. Okay, and a neurosurgeon, Robert Spetzler, and they did a surgery on this lady where they lowered her body temperature to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, drained all the blood from her head so that her brain had ceased functioning by all three clinical tests. Electroencephalogram was silent, brainstem response was absent, no blood flowing through her brain. She was as dead as you can get, and they had all the documentation because they wanted to make sure she was not going to wake up during the surgery, right? So they were monitoring this continually. Additionally, her eyes were taped shut. She was put under deep anesthesia. Brainstem activity was monitored with 100 decibel clicks emitted by small molded speakers inserted into her ears, and her entire body, except for the small surgery area on the head, were covered completely. Yet, when she woke up, she said she talked about an experience that she had during that time when she was clinically dead by all counts. She described in minute detail the specialized instruments that were used for the surgery, the thing that looked more like a drill than a saw. It even had little bits that were kept inside of a case. She described them minutely. These are the instruments that you're not seeing before the surgery or after the surgery. They're over here covered up to keep sterile, and yet she describes them perfectly. Well, during that time, she went through a tunnel, talked to deceased relatives who looked like they were the prime of life, um, and 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 eventually came back and reported these. Now, this is coming from Dr. Sabom's book, and he's got a whole chapter detailing his research into this, where he talked to the doctors, read the doctor's records. He was not even familiar with this. He thought, this sounds crazy. Who would do surgery like this? So he went into it. He ordered the specifications for the instruments that were used to see if they looked like she actually described them. It's just a remarkable case that you can't explain away by saying, oh, well, she may have had the experience before or after the clinical death and just read it back into it. She had to have been there during that time somehow out of her body. Remarkable case.
As I thought about this, I was really skeptical of near death experiences about 7 or 8 years ago when I read your book. But in my 2010 book, Responding to the New Atheists, I had a chapter on evidence for the soul. And I came across the Pam Reynolds case and thought, well, here's just one additional line of evidence for the soul. But it just didn't cross my mind to say, okay, wait a minute. If there's one case, are there more cases? How strong is this? I don't know why I didn't. I thought it's just one small piece of supporting the soul, and I think it does. Now, some of these near-death experiences are more illustrative or worldview focused than others. It seems to me, minimally, they suggest that the physical world is not all there is. They strongly suggest that life continues not forever, but at least for a period of time after the grave, which means I'm not just my body, I'm also a soul. But then there's such a religious, spiritual encounter of like a life review, relationships being restored, a tunnel of light. Like, you've looked at these 5 and many more. What do you conclude from them, like as a whole, in terms of just your worldview and your belief system?
Well, naturalistically, you would expect some event at death to be programmed by your prior expectations. And we've seen that it just does not go according to people's expectations. Even conservative Christians who are they're thinking they're going to go meet Jesus on the other side. They don't think anything about, oh, I'm going to go through a tunnel. I'm going to have this preliminary life review.
Right,
I'm going
right.
to talk to deceased relatives on the way. I mean, this is just totally unexpected. So the fact that there's a pattern at all is remarkable. And they're
Mm.
like 15 or so specific things that across cultures and across the ages have happened. That's remarkable. But to me, again, you can't say, well, this is just God of the gaps. Here's something that we don't understand, so we're going to attribute it to God. No, the event itself, often they're meeting a being of light, they're meeting Jesus, or they're meeting angels, they're meeting deceased relatives. That's a part of the experience. So the afterlife hypothesis ought to be at least a legitimate hypothesis to see what it fits better with the data. To me, the data of 50 years of near-death studies and over, maybe 150 or so years of deathbed studies, maybe 120 years, is just conclusive that these things are happening. You can't deny it. It's happening to such respectable people and such great numbers of people. So you can't just whoosh it away. And it's talking about God and angels. And then you have all these agnostics and atheists that come back saying, okay, the afterlife exists and it's realer than real. To me, all this points to the afterlife. And it's very consistent, I think, with Christian theology. Once you get into the nuance of it all and stick with the best studies rather than just things you hear over the internet.
A friend of mine who's one of the smartest atheists that I know has said there's something about near-death experiences that gives him pause about his naturalism. So if you're watching this and you're a Christian, I think looking into this will really encourage your faith, really help you realize, wow, what I believe about the world, there's empirical and testimonial evidence on top of Scripture. Not that you need it, Scripture's sufficient, but it just encourages us to go, wow, this is really true. If you're a skeptic, look into this. Now, you and I we've done shows, like I mentioned, on does this point towards universalism, and do Hindus see Krishna and Muslims see Muhammad? It turns out that really is far more consistent with Christianity and the number of times people see Jesus than other worldviews. But we talk about that elsewhere. You and I talk about hellish near-death experiences, the evidence for deathbed experiences, I'll link to some below, but there's a ton that people can go to. I'd say keep exploring it, have an open mind. But your book, I think the title, the first one that I read, is just Evidence for Near-Death Experiences. Did I butcher that, Steve?
Near-death experiences as evidence for God in the afterlife.
There it is. Excellent. That book, people can get it on Amazon. They can get it online. And if you do that and write a review, it helps Steve get the word out further. But for those who go, I just don't have the funds right now, or I can't buy another book, you will email them the PDFs of your books if they just contact you. Now, I don't know how much you want to put it out there. Some of your views, your interviews with me have gotten hundreds of thousands. What's the best way for them to contact you where you don't get
Just
overwhelmed?
to differentiate me from the Steve Miller Band, I'm J. Steve Miller, the letter J, Steve Miller at gmail.com. I'm not in this for the money. I'm just fascinated.
Mm,
And if you've got legitimate questions, ask under this video. Really looking at the other 5 videos would catch you up on a lot of the research that's been done. And you could actually read a lot of the comments where I try to answer people's questions. I'm a little bit behind on that, but I try to do that. So that would be good for people who are more listeners than readers. All my books are on Amazon, but again, want a PDF, I'll send it to you free. Can I mention one other thing? I
one more
just think
thing. Yep.
I just think that what this has done for me in my spiritual life. I've been a doubter, questioner, gone through ups and downs of doubts. This has solidified me in my faith. This afterlife apologetics, near death and deathbed experiences, more than anything. I just really don't have any doubts anymore for the first time in my life. It to me, it's like signs and wonders in the Bible, which I mentioned earlier in this interview. These are wonders in the sense that they're just things that astound you, as we've mentioned in this, that make the chills run down your spine. That'll take a doctor, researcher all his life, and then the hairs raise up on his arms. That's the idea I get of the biblical word for wonder. It's something that's astounding, but then it's a pointer in that it points to something. And these people who experience them or study them all of a sudden begin taking the afterlife and
Mm,
God seriously, because to me, the data very strongly points to something more than this life and actually God and the afterlife. So I just encourage people, study this. And we've lost a sense of wonder, I think, sometimes in our
amen.
churches and our Christian walk. Paul said it's not, the kingdom of God is not just about words, but it's about power. And to me, this has really given me the sense of wonder that I feel like I've lacked in my spiritual walk.
I feel the same, and I don't know if I would have gotten there without your research, the books that you've written. So I want to thank you personally for that and encourage others to pick up your books, email you for them, look at the other interviews we've had, maybe some you've done elsewhere. Skeptic or believer, this is worth your time looking into. It's not only interesting, there's some facts there that suggest maybe the world as we see it is not all there is. Now, if you're watching this and you think, wait a minute, why didn't you put this near-death experience in the top 5? Tell us which one you think we should have put and why. Maybe we'll come back to this, and we'd be really curious to see which ones you think are well evidenced. That would help us in the future as well. Friends watching this, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got other shows on near-death experiences probably every 3 to 6 months. I want to keep you up to date with research on this, questions people have about this, other topics as well you will not want to miss on sexuality, the resurrection, etc. Make sure you hit subscribe. And if you thought about studying apologetics, we would love to have you at Talbot School of Theology, Biola. Would love to have you in class. We have a distance program and an on-site program. Information is below. If you're not ready for a PhD, we have a certificate program where we'll kind of walk you through a little bit more formal training you can do at a distance. And we're in the process of updating all that right now. Big discount code below. Steve, always
So
enjoy it. Oh, go
let's
ahead.
think biblically.
Oh, oh, there you go. You got the mug. We
I
gave you
got
a
it
mug,
here.
didn't you?
There we go.
There it
Well,
is.
I
There it
did.
is.
I'm drinking your Kool-Aid. You better not lead me astray.
You're a good man, Steve. Thanks for doing this. We'll do it again.